mentioned at the beginning of this thought primer that Kantianism is a deontological theory of ethics. Deontology is the study of duties. And Kantianism establishes for us what our duties are through the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative identifies for us what the actions are that are always required of us, or what the actions are that we are never permitted to take, no matter what the circumstances are. So in Kantianism, the focus is on the nature of the action itself and not the consequences of the action. In particular, what Kant looks at is whether or not the action that we're considering is universalizable. In other words, is this an action that everybody could always do without running into some sort of logical contradiction, or without destroying the very circumstances that the action is intended to help us navigate, or that the rule is to help us navigate. Now, a lot of people like Kant's focus on actions, in particular when they consider it in relation to some of the consequentialist ethical theories that we looked at earlier, like ethical egoism and utilitarianism. And in particular, what people identify as an attractive feature of Kantianism is its ability to avoid some of those kind of weird situations that we encountered in our exploration of egoism and utilitarianism, where we saw that it was potentially some actions were potentially morally justifiable depending on their consequences, that we wouldn't ordinarily consider to be moral actions. They were actions that would conflict with our common sense understanding of morality. So in utilitarianism and egoism, we saw, well, it's possible that we could justify something like lying, or stealing, or even enslaving people if doing so either advanced our own best interest the most in egoism, or created the greatest good for the greatest number in utilitarianism. And Kantianism doesn't have that same potential because it's not focused on the consequences, but on the inherent qualities of the actions itself. And what Kant would say is actions like lying, stealing, and enslaving, these are not rational kinds of actions, so you're never allowed to do these things, okay? So the focus on duty in Kantianism is an attractive feature, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not without its problems. What if the duties that I recognize come into conflict with one another? Let's say, for example, that you say something like, look, I promised to pick you up at McDonald's at 1 p.m. today. So you've made a promise to me. And you know, as a good Kantian, that you are categorically required to adhere to that promise. You have to fulfill that promise because it's a violation of the categorical imperative to break promises. But after you've made this promise, you find out that your brother's had an accident and really needs you to take him to the hospital. Okay, so now you have a conflict of duties. You have an imperfect duty to always help others, like your brother, when you're able to, and you have a perfect duty to keep your promises. In other words, you have a duty to always keep your promises. Now, in this particular situation, we'd say, well, the perfect duty, the duty to keep my promise, would seem to be more ethically binding than the imperfect duty to help others when I can do so. Because the imperfect duty is not something that I'm required to do all the time, only when I'm able. But I'm duty bound to always keep my promises. And what is the problem here, of course, is that most people are going to look at the promise versus helping the brother and say, look, this is a no-brainer. You're going to have to let this person chill out at McDonald's for a while because your brother's health is what matters more than this person being picked up at McDonald's at the time promised. What if you take like a wedding vow, right? I promise to have you as my husband, my wife, from this day on, better, worse, rich, poor, until death do we part. Okay, so we've made a promise. All right, well, what if my partner jeopardizes my safety? I have a perfect duty, something I always have to do. I always have to protect my well-being. But I also have another perfect duty, which is to always keep promises. Well, what do I do here? Now I have two perfect duties that are categorically required that are in conflict with one another. And it's not real clear in Kantianism how we would resolve these kinds of conflicts.